Good morning. This is Tom Scott, Executive Director with SC Cyber, and I'd like to welcome you to today's version of the Fall Cybersecurity Lecture Series. Today we have Mr. James Perry with us as our guest speaker. I think we've got approximately 8 or 10 folks that are joining us here on the webinar. James, with your permission, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Let me make sure. All right, we're good to go. So again, my name is James Perry. I'm the Associate Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer for the University of South Carolina. That's the system-wide, statewide responsibility. So today I'm going to talk to you about a topic, data-driven security strategy. And my objectives for today's presentation, one is to help identify key challenges that a security leader would face. Second, is to challenge the status quo of how security leaders typically develop strategy. And then the third piece is to outline some principles that I think can help you be successful in a security program. So with that, so imagine you're a brand new Chief Information Security Officer, or you've been given responsibility for a security program. And before you have to think about, how do I execute this job? How do I implement security strategy? Where do I start? Day one on the job, how do I begin the process? What do I focus on? And one of the challenges we have to figure out is, how do we not reinvent the wheel? There's lots of bodies of knowledge out there, lots of frameworks, and so forth.
My apologies.
Okay. Brief technical difficulty.
Why is it pausing?
Click on it again.
Okay. Click over here on the screen?
Nope.
Over here.
Screen share now.
There we go.
Which one do I want to choose?
That would be monitor 2.
I'm going to go with 2 right here. My apologies, James.
No worries. Helps to be able to see the slides.
Last time, it was here.
There we go. There we go. Okay.
Click forward and backwards, you're good?
Okay, we're good. So to kind of restart that thought, so a new security officer, and you're trying to figure out how are you going to be successful managing a security program at the organization you're working for. And any smart person going into an organization would do this with the thought of, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to go out there and figure out how other folks have done this and what the common state of practice is. So you begin to look around, and you may see something like this that says, Step 1, pick a risk management framework, NIST 800-53, ISO 27001, so on. And in that framework is a whole list of security controls. So Step 2 would be, okay, well, I need to figure out where my organization is compared to that framework. So you do a gap analysis. And then Step 3 is you develop a plan to figure out how to solve those issues that are in the gaps. Or, so we've not reinvented the wheel, but we've got an approach that is a little bit difficult. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is the case. You get a little more mature in your process, and you may see a strategy like this. Well, maybe we're going to focus on implementing an enterprise vulnerability management program. We're going to engage third-party providers. We're going to perform comprehensive penetration testing. And then we're going to get vendors to help us identify and invest in next-generation technology that's going to solve all the vulnerabilities. And so we begin working on solving all the vulnerabilities that we have in our organization. That can be an uphill climb, right? So what is the problem with the two approaches that I just suggested? Well, let's go back to this class here and think about the fundamentals of IT security that when you begin to learn about security that we talk about. And number one, lesson one from day one is let's talk about information security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Key principles that we're trying to accomplish in our organization, making sure that only authorized people can access our data, they're not changing it without being approved, and then our systems are up. Along the line, we hit to lesson two, and we start talking about risk management. And we define it using a formula of risk equals threats times vulnerability. Looks innocent enough, so we go on, and we talk about there are four options that you can do with risk. You can avoid it, you can mitigate it, you can accept it, or you can transfer it. But then, think, wait a minute, I'm the one making a decision about what we're gonna do with that risk. I'm responsible for this program, and if something goes wrong, all of the fingers are pointed at me because I'm the security manager and I made the decision. So because we don't want to be the bad guy, we all enjoy continued employment, we start to do things like developing taxonomies of all of the possible risks that we could face. This is a particular example from the Software Engineering Institute, and it gives us a framework to think about the potential risks. Could it be people? Could it be process? Could it be technology? Could it be a mistake? Could it be intentional? Could it be a natural disaster? Could it be a problem in application development? So we identify all of these things that could cause us to have a really bad day, and we create frameworks. And in these frameworks, we identify security controls that are meant to solve or mitigate the risks of all of those bad things that we just talked about. So some examples would be the NIST 800-53, the ISO 27001, and COBIT. And if you look at any one of these frameworks, there are hundreds and hundreds of security controls that they say an organization should implement. So we begin the process, we do a gap analysis of where our organization is compared to the framework, and we begin checking off boxes, what I refer to as checkbox compliance. And we just go down the list, and everything that it says we don't have it says we should have that we do not, we try and figure out how to plug that hole. But there's a problem. I would refer to that as a boil the ocean strategy. And when I say that, what I'm really meaning is if you look at NIST 853 as an example, revision 4, there are 1,682 unique security control elements in that risk framework. They do a great job helping us. They categorize it down to 242 control types. And they were even helpful enough to say, and there are only 122 of those are number one priorities that you should focus on first. I don't know about you, but having 122 number one priorities is not very easy to manage. Does that feel a little like it's an uphill battle, like difficult to be successful? Okay? So I think most organizations that start off with this kind of an approach, which is kind of the normal, find themselves feeling like they can't be successful in a security program. And most of your federal and state agencies and businesses that do work with those federal and state agencies try and follow things like NIST or ISO frameworks. And so it begins. Picking the framework and all that, again, I would say is boiling the ocean. Well, what about the second one? We talked about, well, maybe instead of focusing on just all of the possible risks that could get us, maybe we should focus on just the other side of the equation. So maybe risk isn't the problem. Let's look at the equals threat times vulnerability. And maybe we focus on vulnerability. In this case, we're going to go out and identify every vulnerability in our organization. We're going to do comprehensive scans. We're going to work on patch management and telling people all of the bugs that we found and vulnerabilities we have in an organization and attempt to patch all of that. And then we're going to go buy the latest widget to try and shore up our infrastructure. Well, let's look at that approach. This is the Twitter feed for CVEs, which is the Common Vulnerability and Exposures Database. And I want you to notice something. We're in 2017, and as of right now, we've found 14,693 vulnerabilities just this year that have been discovered. We're in day 265 of the calendar. That's 55.4 vulnerabilities a day that have come out. So what do you do with a vulnerability? Well, you do research, you figure out what the vulnerability means, how it actually works, how it's exploited, and then you have to go map that against your environment and figure out which systems in your environment have that particular vulnerability. Well, at 55 of those a day, are you able to keep up with that? And that's just doing the research to figure out what you're vulnerable to. Then you have to go get all of the devices in your environment, get the patch to them installed. Probably want to test the patch before you deploy it, right? Because it'd be negligent to not do that, especially in a production environment. Feels a little bit like an uphill battle as well, right? You know, maybe, however, you're fortunate and you've got a lot of staff, but I would suggest that we all have constrained resources. We don't have enough money, we don't have enough people to keep up with the volume of vulnerabilities and things that are out there. Can we agree on that? Okay? So you end up looking like a one-man band, trying to keep up with all of the different vulnerabilities, all the different security issues, and ultimately you end up looking silly from a security perspective in terms of your effectiveness. So the other challenge with this is then when your executives ask, how is the security program going? We as a security professional tend to want to say, hey, everything looks great, sunny days, a little bit of cloud, nice temperature, everything's good, boss. And why do we do that? Because we're afraid they're going to shoot the messenger if we tell them the truth, right? That we have got real risks, vulnerabilities, and that it's not a matter of if we're going to be compromised, it's a matter of when. And this is really our current reality. You know, face palm, right? So how do we, it sounds familiar, right? Okay. So is there a simple solution to this? I would say that the answer is yes. And here's what I believe. Let's go back to those risk management principles and let me share a couple of what I believe to be very simple but revolutionary principles that can help a security program become effective. So number one, an individual risk is calculated for a particular threat and vulnerability pair. So it's the combination of threat and vulnerability that we're concerned about. So in the boil the ocean strategy where we pick a framework, we're focused on every potential risk that could happen. Not the probability, not the impact, but just the full laundry list of everything that we could experience. In this approach, then I'm saying, remember back in algebra when we said, or math, we said anything times 0 is equal to what? 0. So if we don't have a threat, the risk is nothing. If we don't have a vulnerability, the risk is nothing. We forget that principle when we think about security strategy. So in order for there to be an actual risk, you have to have both a vulnerability and a threat. Principle number 2, we have the ability to rewrite the formula. What if we made it threat times vulnerability equals risk and we just flipped it? The symmetric property in algebra. So you might say, well, why is that necessary? I would say if we focus on threats first and then let vulnerabilities and risks drive the rest of it, we'll be more successful. You say, but why? Again, we have constrained resources. So let's only focus on those threats that we actually have, then deal with the vulnerabilities related with those threats. Okay, so determine a specific threat, then let vulnerabilities drive your risk reduction. So the absence of a vulnerability means there is no risk, and you want to focus your efforts on those things. So being very strategic about what you focus on. So everything should be made simple and possible, but not simpler, says Einstein. So it's great. We've got a great theory to work from. Let's see how that actually looks in practice. Now, if you've paid any attention to the news lately, you've probably heard about Equifax. Anybody not familiar with what has happened there? Everybody's aware. So let's think about this. If you, so I hear they're looking for a chief security officer. So if any of you apply, and you want to look fantastic in an interview process, I would suggest this line of thinking. Well, the first step if I'm a new security leader for an organization is I want to identify the threats we've talked about. So how am I going to do that? Well, I would suggest that the best place to get data is in your at the local organization in terms of real incidents and real breaches that you've seen at your organization. And hopefully you have a mature security program where you're tracking those issues, the number of phishing emails you get, the number of viruses that you see, the number of attempts on your systems that your firewalls block. When you've had lost and stolen devices that had sensitive data. Hopefully you've got a lot of data about that. Most places aren't that mature, so how do you deal with that? I would suggest there are some really good bits of industry research out there that can give you a starting point. The one that I typically point people to first is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. If you haven't read it, you should. And the reason I believe that is, let's take Equifax as an example. What we see here in the left column on the right side of the chart is the number of incidents that were publicly reported in 2016, categorized in a taxonomy that Verizon has developed. And the left column are incidents, so they had some type of security event, and the right column are those that transitioned or led to a breach where confidentiality was actually broken. So, and it's divided up by sector, so you can see the finance column in the right chart shows that web application attacks accounted for 364 of the known breaches in the finance sector last year. And the method or the action that was taken in those was primarily hacking, 387, social, which would be your phishing attempts, and that's 372, and malware, 370, right? And they were typically going against your servers, people in your organization, your network, right? So seeing that data, what would your focus as the new security leader in that organization likely be? I'm probably going to focus on web application security and making sure that I'm safe from hacking, social attacks, and malware. That's going to be my number one priority. So when I sit down and try and figure out my strategy, I'm going to look at my vulnerabilities in that very specific context and figure out what can I do to mitigate the risk in that particular space. In addition to the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report and some of the other ones I've got listed here, the FireEye, M-Trends, and so on, the other thing that's very helpful are industry sector specific information sharing organizations. In higher education, we have REN-ISAC, there's the MS-ISAC, US-ISAC, and several others. But this is an opportunity in REN-ISAC's case where higher education institutions share threat data and say, hey, the folks at the University of South Carolina are seeing these types of attacks and threats, and we're sharing that with our partners at Clemson University, and they're saying we're seeing these kinds of things. Collectively, we're able to look at that data and say, how are the bad guys targeting the education sector, and what are the biggest things that we're seeing in our area? And the combination of these three types of data can help you be very laser focused and specific in your strategy. Okay? So here's the second piece that you might look at, just an example of the types of data that are helpful. This is from the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, and it shows you the three most common actions or threat patterns here. And the top one is hacking, then malware, then social. So again, if I only have limited resources, limited staff, limited investment, which of the things would I focus on? Pretty self-evident, right? All right, here's another interesting one. What about the 2016, in the 2016 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, if hacking is the number one issue that we need to worry about, and I see information like this that says, on average, 81.9% of the compromises that I have happen within minutes of being attempted. So they identify a machine and they begin trying to gain entry. Almost 82% of the time, they're able to compromise that system in minutes. So we go back to that vulnerability information that we talked about, and if your approach is to focus on enterprise vulnerability management, and there's 55 of these things coming at you a day, how many of those can you research, download the patch, test, implement on all of the devices in your infrastructure and do it within minutes? Not many, okay? So when you begin to look at data like this, it can help you figure out what your strategies might need to look like. And since I can't effectively do that, what else can I do? So data helps in that regard. And then you can look at things like this comes in the 2017 data breach report, and you see 62% of breaches had hacking involved, 51% had malware, 81% involved stolen or weak passwords. Okay, so maybe I should focus on hacking and that, so that probably means I'm missing patches and I want to do patch management and do it well. Probably means that we want to make sure that our end users are not responding to phishing attacks, because that's probably the #1 way that we're getting stolen and credentials. And as we look at this data, it begins to give us a pretty clear focus of what we should target, what we should invest in, and what should be our priorities. Now, it's not to say that you ignore everything else, but that's where you get into the risk management conversation of we mitigate the things that are going to have the biggest impact to us, and some of the smaller threats we may have to accept, or just simply say, you know, we can't accept this and we're not going to do that particular activity. But this is going to give you, from a probability perspective, the best bang for your buck in terms of investment in resource. Okay, so we've figured out what our biggest threats are. So then we begin to start looking at what the vulnerabilities are that are associated with those threats. Here's an interesting chart from the 2015 Data Breach Investigations Report. And when they did an analysis and they looked at all of the compromises or breaches that happened in this data set, 99% of the vulnerabilities that were exploited patches for those had been available for over a year. So that means organizations had a year's time in most cases to download the patches, test them, and roll them out in a methodical way. But in 2015, we were seeing patches that had been released since 1999 that organizations had not deployed. And you can see kind of the distribution, the number of events related to that. So the thing I would say here in terms of reducing our vulnerability would be have a solid patch management process. And it doesn't necessarily have to be super fast, but effective and routine, right? Here's another interesting one that just came out in this year's version of the DBIR. And this talks about how fast particular industries, when a new vulnerability or patch is released, are they identifying it, installing it, and getting to complete coverage within their organization. And unfortunately, what keeps me up at night is that when we look at the very bottom chart, this is education. It looks like from this chart, we do a very bad job. Like over 12 weeks, we get to around 12 to 18% of our devices in our environment fully protected. Well, why is that? Well, one is we have a lot of students that we don't control the devices, and it's very difficult for us to force students to apply patches. But from an industry perspective, education is probably one of the worst at this. So questions would be, well, how do we improve that and do better as an institution? And if the culture of our organization is that this is the reality, then what do we do differently? And our strategy may look very different than what's happening up in manufacturing. And the other thing I think this helps us is, I don't know about other industries, but in higher education, the common question is, well, University of South Carolina, what are your peers at Clemson University doing, or your peers at Georgia? And we do a lot of comparative benchmarking against our peers. When I get asked those questions and I have this data, I say, you know, quite honestly, I don't really care what another educational institution is doing. I want to know what they're doing in the information sector, because they're doing a much better job than we are in higher education. And having data like this will resonate with your board or your leadership for them to say, oh, okay, I see what you mean. So that can be very helpful. Here's another interesting piece. So we said earlier in looking at the financial industry that malware was a big problem. And so the question was, well, where is most of the malware coming from? In higher education, you can see the orange boxes here towards the bottom in the middle. Probably 85% of all of the malware is embedded in Microsoft Office type attachments, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. Now, you as a security officer, how successful are you going to be at getting adoption from your folks by saying we're going to block all Microsoft Office attachments being sent via email? Can you make that decision? No. I see a lot of heads saying no. Okay, so maybe then we've got to figure out a different strategy or look at different solutions to solve that problem, because we have to be able to send Word attachments and Office attachments. And then we've also got the application issues down here, whether it's Java updates or Adobe Reader updates or Flash or whatever. But in this case, 85% of the time it was related to an Office attachment. And that's something that most users get. And they get the, hey, you see the attached invoice, they click on it, and boom, they've got the malware. Another interesting one here, and I think this is one of my personal pet peeves. So what you see here is some research that they did last year in the 2016 Verizon report, and it shows that 99% of all of the malware hashes that were seen in this data set were only observed for 58 seconds or less. Why is that important? Well, think about all the technology that we typically deploy. Anti-malware on our endpoint devices. You've got antivirus running. We hear things from various vendors that say, our tool detects 100% of known issues. Well, if each of those issues gets a unique hash that fingerprints it, and they're only seen for 58 seconds, how effective is that tool at protecting your organization? For a minute, it's probably good. But why is this the case? Well, what's happening is the bad guys are taking a virus and writing it in such a way that when it attacks me, it has this fingerprint, and then it intentionally changes something about itself so that its fingerprint now is slightly different. And each time it hits a different person, it looks different from the time before. So this whole signature hashing capability has shifted to where having signature-based technology, whether it's antivirus or other product of the day, if it's simply using signatures, you're probably not going to have an effective tool. So why do I say that? Having this kind of data, in my role as a security officer, I probably get 10 or 15 phone calls a day from various vendors trying to position a product for me. And they all want to tell me how successful their product is at blocking known threats, and that if we'd had this threat, it would have blocked that attack. I probably got 50 calls about the WannaCry ransomware earlier this year. And I simply asked questions about, well, how does your technology work? Well, it uses signatures. End of phone call. So if so having this data and understanding it available can help you be wise in selecting products that you invest in and implement in your infrastructure. So you've developed some strategies and identified the vulnerabilities. So how do we go from there? And we put specific strategies in place. Then we have the ability to sit down in front of our leadership and say with confidence, we've looked at industry research, we've looked at all of the vulnerabilities. Here is how we're going to solve our biggest problems. Here's the resources that we have, how we're going to invest it. Here's what we're focused on and why. And the other things that could get us, we have cyber insurance for, we have other mitigating things in place, but our focus is in solving this thing. And it's just like, think about your experience at home. If your house is situated in a floodplain, you probably have flood insurance. If it's on the top of a mountain, you probably don't have it, but is it possible that you could have water damage or some flooding by some natural event? Maybe. 2 years ago, folks in Colombia would have said, we've never had flooding to that degree in this neighborhood, the 500-year flood. So we're not focused on flood insurance and controls that would deal with that. You would ask that same person this year, and they would say, well, 2 years ago we had flooding in our in our neighborhood, and we had that 500-year event. So this thing shifts as you learn more information, there's new data, and so on. But I believe that in that you can take a security program, focus on the things that are of most importance, and not boil the ocean and deal with resource constraints. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, so I'll lead with one of the questions, James, that we got on the webinar. Can you take us back on your slide deck to the Verizon report? And I will try and read that one there. So what's the difference between the first two columns?
Yeah, so the column on the left are security incidents. These are incidents that didn't involve the compromise of credentials or the breach of data. So, for example, one of the big things you see is this denial of service attack. It affected our availability, but it didn't result in a confidentiality disclosure or a breach of data. Whereas the right column, it was an incident, but it also resulted in the loss of credit cards, the loss of medical records, unauthorized access to data. And in our case, those issues are typically more costly and more problematic for an organization versus our internet connection suffered a denial of service attack. So depending on, and that's a great question, depending on your business, the data in the left column may be more interesting. So if you're a business like Amazon and your revenue is driven on online sales, you may be mostly focused on incidents and specifically denial of service where someone could take down your online site. But if you're a hospital and you're trusted with protecting medical data, you may be more focused on breaches to your data. And so which column you use and start with may depend on the nature of your business. And
for the students in the class, and just sharing with you, we actually on Wednesday had a slide that looked very much like this. Mm-hmm. And we actually talked about the fact that it's the entertainment industry that was falling in the left-hand column, mm-hmm. especially for denial of service. So I'm not thinking anybody's attacking Sony in terms of denial of service, right. But certainly your spectrums and your cable providers, mm-hmm. anyone that's doing kind of networking or telecom. And then even more so, and we've talked about the threat related to intellectual property, yeah. I think the entertainment industry, so you did a good job there because one of our projects, I think as you know, is that each of the students here has to pick a critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. They have to identify themselves as a candidate for a CISO position in a company within that infrastructure. Yep. And they have to write a letter of introduction and a strategy for how they would approach coming in as the new CISO. So I appreciate your presentation because you did a good job showing these guys. And I know what's going to happen is I'm going to go back to Blackboard and everyone's going to want Equifax and they're going to use your presentation here as their project. So we actually talked about Equifax the other day. Yep. Not necessarily as a poster child because anybody can be on the front page of the paper as that poster child. And some of the other information that you shared with us here, I think resonates very well with the things that we've talked about in class as well. How about any additional questions, either to our attendees online or to anyone here in the class?
But while those are coming up, let me say one thing about your comment there, Tom. I think when you look at an organization and when you think about, well, my organization is a state agency or I have contracts with state and federal governments and they require me to comply with, let's say, NIST requirements in this case. The natural tendency, and this is what I'm challenging in my presentation, is that the natural tendency is just to go look at all of the list of things that NIST says you should do and then figure out which ones we're missing and just start plucking them off and do that with no mind to this chart here and the actual threats that we face. I'm suggesting that rather than try and do 300 or 400 things, do the things that matter most first and then get to those other things, and make sure that you're doing these fundamental things very, very well, very mature, and then go to all of the, do I have a check-in policy for the data center to see who visited?
Right.
I don't know the last time that security control stopped a breach.
Okay.
At least in my environment.
So let me ask you then, for government, we clearly have NIST, 800-53, Rev 4, Rev 5, et cetera. I would say that the ISO 22701 is probably a strong one for industry standards. What is the name of your model? Is this the Perry?
No, so let me clarify. I am not against risk frameworks. I think they are very valuable tools when used properly. And what I mean by that is, so here at the University of South Carolina, our model is to look at this threat data like we've talked about today, and what we've developed is what we call the minimum security standards. They are very intentionally selected, research-based, and supported initiatives that directly relate to the threats that we face. So one we talked about in here is social engineering and phishing attacks and the use of stolen credentials. So this year you saw the University of South Carolina do a university-wide deployment of multi-factor authentication. The reason that we selected that as our one big thing to invest in is because 81% of all incidents involve stolen credentials. So with that one implementation, we mitigated risk of 81% of the things that would cause us to have a bad day.
Sounds like smarter security.
Work smart, not hard.
Okay.
Now, that being in mind, when we get when multi-factor authentication was completed, we're not done. Then we go look at the list and say, what is the next biggest thing that would cause us a bad day? And so now what you see is we're working on how do we get rid of malicious URLs and emails and malicious attachments. So we talked about Office attachments are the #1 way in which viruses get into the environment. So now we're working on, and our students on October 16th will get new email-based security that will help us defend against that. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't use a risk framework. We absolutely should, but we start with the threats, figure out the vulnerabilities, and then look at risk frameworks to figure out what controls they suggest for us to deal with that particular issue.
So that would lead me to believe that you have less than 122 priority ones.
Yes, I have 7.
Okay. That sounds like a whole lot more number to be able to manage.
Yes.
Okay.
And even 7 is challenging at times, but that's where we're focused today.
Okay. I have another question from the webinar. All right, so I'm going to read this exactly as it was stated.
Okay.
It says, it sounds like you aren't a fan of signature-based malware scanners. Have you found reliable behavior analysis tool sets? In the signature study you cited, was that specifically binary file signature, or did you include network traffic signatures?
Okay. So there's a couple responses to that. We invest in traditional intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, things that leverage that. Those types of technologies, whether it's behavioral analysis or signature-based detection. And we still see instances of where people have old malware and they attempt to reuse it. So it's by no means am I saying you shouldn't use it, but when that's your only method of defense, and you rest on comfort that you've got that technology in place, chances are you're missing it. Here's the other problem that we're dealing here with at the university, is that 60 to 65% of our network traffic today is encrypted, which means that the traditional tools that do signature-based detection can't see the contents of the traffic anyway, so those tools are ineffective. So you have to look at and be smart about what does my environment look like, what does the traffic look like. Again, back to data-driven strategy. Just because a tool can look at it, is the traffic on my network even visible because it's encrypted or not? And so you have to do those things. To answer the question more specifically, we are heavily invested in a slightly different approach to where we are identifying and blocking threats at the DNS level. using tools like Cisco Umbrella and OpenDNS to where it's more an IP address or a domain that is known to be malicious that it blocks rather than a particular instance. And it's more associated with the person or the source on the internet that's causing the bad traffic than a particular instance of them being malicious. And we've seen great benefit from that approach.
Okay, following up additional questions coming in from our online viewers. You referred on one of your slides to the information sector.
Yep.
How is that defined either by you or by Verizon?
I believe these are using the U.S. commerce codes and industry designations. I forget the exact name for that, but I believe that they would identify that as like ISPs and things like that, service providers.
Okay. And then last question here as we get ready to wrap up, and that would be if a contract requires a specific framework or controls, do you have a recommendation on how you would integrate your data-driven methodology within some of those common frameworks?
Yeah, we have that issue here at the university. Obviously, we have HIPAA regulation compliance issues, PCI compliance issues, and a host of other things. In those areas where you have a regulatory requirement and you are contractually signing up to agree to that, you absolutely have to do the full scope of the work. It's a contractual or regulatory issue. What I would say is that you need to fully understand the implication of what you're committing to and the resources that would go into meeting that contractual obligation. And I think oftentimes we underestimate or just assume that we've got that in place. And the reality is most organizations, in fact, I don't know of any that are fully compliant with a NIST framework.
Well, and I would think in addition that in a assessment of some sort, or you're working within that framework, you would clearly be able to come back, as you said, and check off the boxes.
Mm-hmm.
But I would hope that you as a security professional, and not necessarily you, but whoever's doing this type of work, in your recommendations to your client, that you would clearly identify, here is what the risks are, and here is what you should be focusing on based on the data and the analysis that we have done as part of this entire assessment.
Yeah, and I would respond to that in two ways. There are some regulations or things like the payment card industry's data security standards that are very prescriptive, black and white, here's what I have to do, and there's really very little room for interpretation. So you have to do the full body of those things. When you think about HIPAA regulation, they define some as required, in which you must do all, and they define some as addressable. And they leave it up to the risk analysis and the determination of the organization to decide whether or not they implement this control and to what extent. So they give you the ability to do a risk management process where you focus on threats and vulnerabilities to decide what level of control you put in place. And so I think there's still room for this thought process in that construct.
Okay. Well, good. And I think as another compliment for your presentation, the slide that you showed related to education, and that one was the one that was the not necessarily the lowest hanging fruit, but the lowest scoring sector. And the fact that, as you pointed out to the students, if you look at some of your peers there, whether they were in the manufacturing sector or the information sector, they were hitting those targets at a quicker rate and a higher level of efficiency and effectiveness than education. So what Mr. Perry was demonstrating is look at who your peers are and who's out there that may be performing well and performing successfully, and figure out what their strategies are and see whether you can inculcate those or bring those in-house and use some of those same successful strategies in your particular sector.
Yep. Well, and oftentimes that's where the greatest friction in security leadership comes from is in a lot of other industries, Department of Defense and places like that, The traditional end user does not have administrative privileges on their device to install whatever software they want. Can you imagine me coming to the university and telling students that you can no longer install software on your own personally owned device? Probably not a very popular stance. So how do we deal with that, and how do we compensate for that reality in our culture? So it is a lot of this is knowing your organization, what you can and can't do from a policy perspective, and understanding the mission of your business, and then applying all of this to that context.
All right, James, thank you so much for your time and your fantastic presentation this morning. We've answered some of the questions that we received on the webinar, as well as some of the ones here in the class. I would welcome everybody to join us 1 week from today, September 22nd, from 9:30 to 10:30, where our guest speaker for the lecture series will be Brian Bannister, the Chief Information Security Officer for South Carolina's Department of Health and Environmental Control. So with that, we're going to sign off for the day. I appreciate everyone's participation, both in the classroom and online. And everyone have a great Friday and a great weekend. Thank you.